There is a particular kind of silence that follows a war nobody won. Not the silence of rubble or grief or exhaustion, though all of those are present. It's the silence of powerful men in expensive rooms, staring at maps, realizing that everything they were certain of 3 months ago has turned out to be wrong. That silence is Washington right now. The United States military is the most sophisticated, most expensive, most technologically dominant fighting force ever assembled by any civilization in human history. Its annual defense budget exceeds the combined military spending of the next 10 nations on Earth. Its naval power can project force to any coastline on the planet within days. Its intelligence architecture spans continents. Its precision strike capability can thread a missile through a specific window of a specific building in a city its pilots have never visited. And yet, 3 months after the most intense American and Israeli military campaign against Iran since the Islamic Revolution, none of the four objectives publicly stated at the outset of this conflict have been achieved. Iran's ballistic missile program has not been destroyed. Its naval capacity in the Persian Gulf remains operational. Its network of regional proxies, battered, yes, degraded, certainly, has not been severed, and Iran has not signed away its nuclear future. What it has done is something far more strategically interesting, something that military planners at the Pentagon are finding almost impossible to model, because it doesn't fit the framework through which American strategic thinkers have understood warfare for the past half-century. Iran weaponized the cost of war itself. To understand why that works, you have to go back further than the bombs. You have to go back to the fundamental asymmetry at the heart of this conflict. Not military asymmetry, which is obvious, but economic and psychological asymmetry, which is far more consequential. When the United States decides to use military force, it is making a decision that ultimately gets filtered through a democratic political system with a 2-year electoral cycle, a media ecosystem that amplifies casualties and costs in real time, and a financial market architecture that prices geopolitical risk into equities, energy futures, and bond spreads within hours. Every week this conflict continues has a visible, quantifiable domestic cost: fuel prices, insurance premiums, supply chain disruptions. The political price of extended engagement rises with each news cycle. America, for all its military power, is structurally impatient. Tehran operates in almost the mirror opposite condition. The Islamic Republic has spent 40 years building an economy and a political system specifically designed to absorb external pressure. Not comfortably, not without pain, but with a capacity for endurance that Western analysts have consistently underestimated, in part because they project their own institutional incentive structures onto a system that simply does not share them. When the Iranian leadership calculates the cost of this war, it is not doing so through the lens of quarterly approval ratings or NASDAQ futures. It is doing so through the lens of revolutionary legitimacy, theological endurance, and generational timescales. This is not an ideological observation. It is a structural one. Iran's strategy from the first week of serious escalation was not to win militarily, because its military planners are not naive. They know what American air power can do. They watched what happened in Iraq in 1991, in Yugoslavia in 1999, in Afghanistan, in Libya. They had no illusions about what precision munitions launched from B-2 bombers at 50,000 feet would do to surface installations. What they calculated, correctly as it turns out, is that the destruction of installations is not the same as the destruction of strategic capacity, and that a war's political outcome is not determined by who inflicts the most damage, but by who can tolerate the most damage relative to what they're fighting for. That calculation led to a decision that changed the entire shape of this conflict. Rather than concentrating its defensive effort on protecting fixed military assets, which are inherently vulnerable, Iran dispersed. It distributed. It went deep underground where possible, dispersed its command architecture, and simultaneously began activating what strategists now call its asymmetric economic warfare doctrine: the targeting of energy infrastructure across the Gulf, disruption of commercial shipping lanes through the Strait of Hormuz, Precision harassment of civilian maritime traffic in a way carefully calibrated to impose maximum economic cost while remaining just below the threshold that would trigger a qualitatively different American response. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a body of water, it is the circulatory system of the global energy economy. Approximately 20% of all oil traded globally and roughly 30% of liquefied natural gas passes through a corridor that is at its narrowest point just 39 kilometers wide. Iran sits on one bank of that corridor. It has spent decades developing the doctrine, the weapons, and the institutional knowledge to threaten that corridor without necessarily closing it completely, because partial disruption is actually more strategically useful than total closure. Total closure invites maximum response. Sustained, calibrated disruption creates sustained, calibrated economic pain, which is exactly what Tehran needed to manufacture. The effect on global energy markets was not subtle. Oil prices, which had already been elevated by pre-conflict tensions, spiked sharply in the opening weeks of the campaign. Shipping insurance rates for Gulf transit became, in the language of Lloyd's underwriters, extraordinary. Several major tanker operators quietly began rerouting around the Cape of Good Hope, adding 2 to 3 weeks to delivery times and billions to operational costs. The inflationary pressure this created in already strained Western economies was not catastrophic, but it was real, and it was politically visible, and it fed directly into the domestic pressure on the governments most responsible for sustaining the campaign. Here is the strategic irony that Washington finds most uncomfortable to acknowledge. The more successfully the US and Israel struck Iranian military infrastructure, the more Tehran accelerated its economic disruption campaign. Every destroyed base became a political justification for another tanker harassed. Every publicized airstrike became a narrative tool for rallying regional sympathy and tightening the informal networks that sustain Iranian proxy influence. Destruction in this conflict was not deterrence, it was provocation, and Iran used it as such with considerable discipline. The proxy network is worth examining carefully because it is one of the areas where Western analysis has been most consistently oversimplified. The conventional framework treats groups like the Houthis in Yemen, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and various Iraqi militia formations as Iranian puppet forces, extensions of Tehran's will that can be controlled by cutting the string. The reality is considerably more complicated, and the complications cut against American strategic assumptions. These are organizations with their own political legitimacy, their own domestic constituencies, their own historical grievances that predate Iranian involvement. Iranian support, financial, military, logistical, matters enormously to their capability, but their motivation is not purely instrumental. Reducing them to Iranian proxies misunderstands the organic roots of their power, and it leads to a military strategy built on severing supply lines that, when severed, simply reconstitute through different channels. The Houthis remain the clearest example. American and allied airstrikes against Houthi infrastructure in Yemen have been ongoing at varying intensities for years. The strikes have degraded specific capabilities. They have not ended Houthi capacity to threaten Red Sea shipping. The group has demonstrated a remarkable ability to absorb kinetic pressure, adapt its tactics, and continue operations at a level that keeps global shipping routes economically destabilized. This is asymmetric warfare functioning almost perfectly as its theorists imagined. A relatively small, relatively low-budget force imposing costs on the global economy that are orders of magnitude larger than the cost of maintaining the threat. And now we arrive at the negotiations, because eventually, wars that nobody wins arrive at tables where nobody wants to be. The structure of the current diplomatic impasse reveals, in compressed form, everything that has gone wrong with the American strategic conception of this conflict. The United States entered these talks expecting to negotiate from a position of demonstrated military dominance. The logic was straightforward. We have destroyed your infrastructure, eliminated your leadership figures, degraded your military capacity. Now you will accept our terms. This is how powerful states have historically expected negotiations with weaker adversaries to proceed. Tehran's response has been to treat the negotiating table as an extension of the battlefield. Not in a theatrical sense, but in a deeply strategic one. Iranian negotiators have not come to the table to surrender. They have come to extract concessions in the diplomatic domain to compensate for costs absorbed in the military domain. The delay itself is a tactic. Every week of negotiation without agreement is a week in which Hormuz remains economically threatening, in which American political patience erodes further, in which the domestic coalitions supporting the campaign in Washington grow marginally weaker. The Trump administration's stated desire for a quick and easy resolution, a phrase with a long and painful history in American military policy, has been precisely the psychological lever that Iranian negotiators have been pressing. When your opponent has publicly signaled that speed matters to him, you make speed expensive. You create conditions under which the fastest path to resolution requires concessions. And then you wait because you have more tolerance for waiting than he does. This is not a new strategy. It is almost textbook asymmetric diplomatic warfare. What is remarkable is not that Iran is using it, but that American planners seem to have been genuinely surprised by it. There is a historical parallel that demands attention here, though it is one that American policymakers find deeply uncomfortable to invoke. The Vietnam War's final years presented a structurally similar problem. An overwhelmingly powerful military force, able to impose enormous destruction on a much weaker adversary, found itself unable to translate military dominance into political outcomes, because the adversary's tolerance for cost exceeded the political system's willingness to continue bearing it. The Paris Peace Accords were not a negotiated victory. They were a managed exit from an unwinnable position, dressed in diplomatic language that allowed all parties to claim something. The consequences of that conflict's actual outcome arrived later, at a pace that history absorbed without admitting the original strategic failure. Washington is not at that point yet, but the structural rhyme is audible to anyone willing to listen. The nuclear question sits at the center of all of this, like a gravitational mass that bends every other trajectory. This is where the stakes leave the domain of geopolitical competition and enter something more consequential. Iran has not achieved a nuclear weapon as of this writing, but its nuclear program has not been destroyed either, and here the technical realities of modern nuclear infrastructure create a problem that military strikes cannot solve in any durable way. Nuclear knowledge does not evaporate when you bomb a centrifuge facility. The expertise, the institutional knowledge, the human networks that understand how to reconstruct a program, these survive physical destruction with relative ease. Iran demonstrated this after the Stuxnet cyber attack destroyed roughly a fifth of its centrifuges in 2010. Within 2 years, the program had not only recovered, but expanded. Physical strikes on nuclear infrastructure create delays, not endings, and delays have a political cost. Every delay must be paid for again, through another strike, another round of sanctions, another cycle of escalation. The question is not whether Iran can be physically prevented from achieving nuclear capability. The question is whether there exists any political arrangement that makes them choose not to. That question is fundamentally diplomatic, not military. And diplomacy requires acknowledging the other party's interests as real, which is something the current political atmosphere in Washington makes extraordinarily difficult. The economic dimension of this conflict is the layer that global audiences have understood least, and it may ultimately be the most consequential. The sanctions architecture built against Iran over 4 decades is one of the most comprehensive economic isolation regimes in history. It has genuinely cost Iran enormous amounts in lost oil revenue, restricted technology access, inflation, currency depreciation, and investment flight. And yet Iran's economy has not collapsed. It has contracted, distorted, adapted, and survived, because Iran has systematically built alternative networks for moving money, selling oil, and acquiring technology that circumvent the formal financial system. China is the central node in this alternative architecture. Iranian oil, sold at discounts to Chinese refiners in defiance of American sanctions, has provided Tehran with a revenue stream that sanctions were designed to eliminate. The scale of this trade is difficult to quantify precisely because it operates through obfuscated channels: ship-to-ship transfers, falsified documentation, third-country intermediaries. But credible estimates from institutions including the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and various intelligence-adjacent research centers suggest that Iran has been moving somewhere between 1.5 and 1.8 million barrels of oil per day to Asian buyers, primarily Chinese. At current prices, that represents revenues of roughly $40 to $50 billion annually. Not enough to fund a modern military superpower, more than enough to fund a sophisticated asymmetric warfare strategy. This is the architecture that American economic pressure has failed to dismantle, and the failure is structural, not accidental. Secondary sanctions, the mechanism by which the U.S. attempts to punish non-American entities for doing business with Iran, have a fundamental limit. They require the threat of exclusion from the American financial system and the American market to be credible deterrents. For Chinese state-owned enterprises and Chinese financial institutions, whose primary market is increasingly not the United States, this deterrent has lost much of its historical bite. The weaponization of the dollar, over decades of overuse as a geopolitical instrument, has quietly accelerated the construction of alternative financial infrastructure designed specifically to function without dollar intermediation. Iran benefits from this shift without having caused it. It is a strategic gift from the very sanctions pressure that was designed to cripple it. There is a question that rarely gets asked in this context, but which cuts to the deepest structural problem America faces in this conflict. It is not a question about Iran's military capability, or its economic resilience, or its diplomatic maneuvering. It is a question about strategic ends. What does American victory actually look like here? What specific, achievable outcome, realistically attainable given the actual constraints of the situation, would constitute success? The public framing of objectives, eliminate the nuclear program, destroy proxy networks, achieve behavioral change, describes outcomes. It does not describe a realistic causal pathway from here to those outcomes, given what we now know about the limits of military pressure in producing them. Strategy without a credible theory of change is not strategy. It is hope expressed in the language of force. Iran's leadership, whatever its many profound failures in the domestic domain, has maintained a remarkably consistent strategic theory for 4 decades. It has bet, repeatedly and with costly discipline, that the United States has more to lose from sustained conflict than Iran does. Not in military terms. Iran has never been under any illusion about the military balance, but in political, economic, and psychological terms. In terms of domestic political sustainability, in terms of alliance cohesion, in terms of the long-run costs to American global credibility of visibly failing to achieve stated objectives against a mid-sized regional power. That bet has paid off before. It is paying off again. And the most extraordinary feature of this moment is not Iran's resilience, which is real but not unlimited. It is the genuine uncertainty that now hangs over the entire American strategic posture in the Middle East. If the most powerful military in human history cannot translate force into durable political outcomes against Iran, even after conducting one of the most intensive bombing campaigns since the Second World War, then the foundational assumption of American primacy in the region, the assumption that overwhelming force applied with political will can reshape the strategic environment, requires serious reconsideration. That reconsideration is not happening at the speed the situation demands. It is being deferred by the institutional momentum of organizations that have built their identity, their budgets, and their doctrine around the primacy of hard power. This is not unique to the American system. It is how all large military establishments respond to strategic disconfirmation. The evidence that the existing approach is failing gets filtered through institutions that have powerful internal incentives to interpret it as evidence that the approach needs more resources, not fundamental revision. Meanwhile, the negotiations continue. The Strait of Hormuz continues to cast its shadow over global energy markets. The proxy networks continue to adapt and reconstitute. The nuclear knowledge continues to reside in the minds of Iranian scientists who survived the strikes on their facilities. And Iran continues to do something that requires no military hardware, no advanced technology, no financial sophistication. It continues to wait. In the arithmetic of this particular conflict, patience has turned out to be the decisive weapon. Not because Iran is winning in any traditional sense. Its people are suffering. Its economy is under extraordinary stress. Its future is genuinely uncertain. But because in a conflict where the outcome is determined not by who inflicts the most destruction, but by who can sustain political will the longest, the structural advantages are not uniformly American. They never were. The lesson that this conflict is slowly, expensively, painfully teaching is one that every empire in history has eventually learned, usually later than it should have. The capacity to destroy is not the same as the capacity to decide. The ability to strike any target on Earth is not the same as the ability to determine the political future of a civilization that has been navigating conquest, resistance, and survival for 25 centuries. There will be a deal, eventually. There always is. And when it comes, it will be dressed in the language of mutual achievement and diplomatic success, because all parties need something they can take home. But beneath the language, the structural reality will be legible to anyone who followed the actual trajectory of this conflict from its beginning. America did not lose this war in any battlefield sense. Wars of this kind are not lost on battlefields. They are lost in the accumulated weight of unachieved objectives, of costs that compound beyond their original political budgets, of adversaries who understood something fundamental about the nature of the conflict that the more powerful party did not fully reckon with until it was strategically expensive to admit. The most dangerous weapon Iran brought to this conflict was not a missile, or a drone swarm, or a nuclear program. It was a theory of how power actually works, a theory that the most powerful military force on Earth spent 3 months and enormous resources proving correct. That should disturb everyone who cares about how the next conflict begins, and how the one after that gets decided before the first bomb falls.